Welcome to Miss Scarlett. Subscribe and don't miss out on Patreon. Have fun! As the moon's luminescence bathed the room, Scott silently locked his bedroom door, feeling both exhilarated and anxious with each passing second. He held tightly to his prized possession, his sister's ruby-hued silk dress, which had slipped through his fingers effortlessly. This clandestine ritual had become a nightly addiction. With every fiber of his being, Scott gently removed his everyday attire, littering the floor with discarded garments as he prepared for his nightly metamorphosis. He paused, briefly embracing the cool evening air on his bare skin, before passionately donning the silk dress. The luxurious fabric seemed to flow and embrace him, offering an unfamiliar sensation that danced down his body. Glancing in the mirror, Scott's reflection became a captivating sight, causing him to pause and marvel at the sight. For a moment, he could almost imagine he was looking at someone else entirely. Someone softer, more graceful. "This is who I'm meant to be," he whispered to his reflection, barely audible even in the silence of his room. Reluctantly, Scott removed the dress and carefully hung it back in his sister's closet. As he crawled into bed, his mind swirled with images of flowing fabric and elegant heels. He drifted off to sleep with a small smile on his face, dreaming of a life where he could be his true self. In his dreams, Scott found himself walking through a misty forest. The ground beneath his feet was soft and yielding, and he realized he was wearing delicate high heels. Looking down, he saw the hem of a flowing dress swishing around his ankles. His heart leapt with joy as he raised his hands to his face, finding soft skin and long, flowing hair. The mist began to clear, revealing a shimmering lake. Scott approached the water's edge, eager to see his reflection. As he leaned over, he gasped at the image looking back at him. A beautiful woman with long auburn hair and bright green eyes stared up from the surface of the lake. She smiled, and Scott felt his own lips curve upward in response.
"This is who you truly are,"
a voice whispered on the wind.
"Embrace your truth."
Scott woke with a start, his heart racing. Something felt different, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He blinked sleepily, reaching up to rub his eyes, and froze. His hand didn't look like his hand anymore. It was smaller, more delicate, with long, slender fingers and neatly manicured nails. Sitting up abruptly, Scott felt a strange weight on his chest. He looked down and let out a small gasp. Where once there had been a flat, masculine chest, there were now two perfectly formed breasts. His entire body had changed, curves replacing angles, softness where there had once been hardness. Scott scrambled out of bed, nearly tripping over his own feet as he rushed to the mirror. The person staring back at him was the same woman he'd seen in his dream. Long auburn hair cascaded over her shoulders, framing a heart-shaped face with high cheekbones and full lips. Green eyes wide with shock blinked back at him.
I'm a woman,"
Scott whispered, his voice higher and softer than before.
"But how? This can't be real."
She pinched herself, wincing at the sharp pain. This was no dream. Somehow, impossibly, Scott had transformed into a woman overnight. As the initial shock began to wear off, Scott, or rather, the woman who had been Scott, realized she needed a new name. Ruby, she thought suddenly. It felt right, like it had been waiting for her all along. Ruby took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She needed to figure out what to do next. First things first, she needed clothes. Her pajamas from the night before were now comically large on her new frame. She opened her closet door, half expecting to see her old clothes. Instead, she gasped in surprise. The entire wardrobe had transformed along with her. Gone were the t-shirts and jeans, replaced by an array of feminine clothing. Dresses in various styles and colors hung neatly, alongside blouses, skirts, and even a few pairs of elegant heels. Ruby reached out, running her fingers over a soft red dress that reminded her of the one she'd borrowed from her sister. Without hesitation, she pulled it off the hanger and slipped it on. The fabric settled perfectly against her new curves, as if it had been made just for her. She turned back to the mirror, marveling at her reflection. The dress complemented her auburn hair beautifully, making her green eyes seem to sparkle. For the first time in her life, Ruby felt truly comfortable in her own skin. A sudden knock at the door made her jump. "Scott!" her mother's voice called. "Are you up? Breakfast is ready." Ruby's heart raced. How was she going to explain this to her family? Would they even believe her? She cleared her throat, trying to make her new voice sound as much like her old one as possible. "I'm not feeling well," she called back. "I think I might stay in bed today." There was a pause on the other side of the door. "All right, honey. Let me know if you need anything." Ruby let out a sigh of relief as she heard her mother's footsteps retreat down the hallway. She had bought herself some time, but she knew she couldn't hide in her room forever. She needed help, someone she could trust to believe her incredible story. Mike. The thought came to her suddenly. Mike had been her best friend since childhood. If anyone would understand and support her through this, it would be him. Ruby fumbled for her phone, relieved to find it still on her nightstand. She quickly typed out a message. "Mike, I need your help. Something incredible has happened. Can you come over? It's an emergency." The response came almost immediately.
On my way. Everything okay?
Ruby's fingers hovered over the keyboard. How could she possibly explain this in a text? "You'll see when you get here," she finally replied. "Please hurry." While waiting for Mike to arrive, Ruby explored her new wardrobe. She found a pair of black flats that seemed easier to manage than heels and slipped them on. In her jewelry box, she discovered a delicate silver necklace with a ruby pendant. How fitting, she thought with a small smile. The sound of the doorbell made her jump. She heard her mother answer the door, followed by Mike's familiar voice. "Is Scott home? He texted me saying it was an emergency." Ruby's heart pounded as she heard footsteps approaching her room. There was a knock at the door. "Scott," Mike called. "It's me. What's going on?" Taking a deep breath, Ruby opened the door. Mike's jaw dropped, his eyes widening in shock. What? Who are you?" he stammered. Ruby pulled him into the room, quickly shutting the door behind him. "Mike, it's me," she said softly. "It's Scott. I know this is going to sound crazy, but I woke up like this." Mike stared at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and confusion.
"That's impossible," he said. "Scott's a guy. You're
a woman," Ruby finished for him. "I know. I don't understand it either. But it's really me, Mike. Remember when we were 10 and you fell out of that tree in my backyard? You made me promise never to tell anyone you cried." Mike's face paled.
Scott?
He whispered. But how? Ruby shook her head. I have no idea. I went to sleep last night as myself, and I woke up like this. She gestured to her body. Everything's changed. My clothes, my voice, everything. Mike sank down onto the edge of the bed, running a hand through his hair.
This is insane,
he muttered.
Things like this don't just happen.
I know, Ruby said, sitting down next to him. But it has happened. And I don't know what to do, Mike. How am I supposed to explain this to my family, to the world? Mike was quiet for a long moment, processing the impossible situation before him. Finally, he looked up at Ruby, his expression softening.
Okay,
he said.
I believe you. It's crazy, but I believe you. And I'm here for you, whatever you need.
Ruby felt tears welling up in her eyes. She threw her arms around Mike, hugging him tightly.
Thank you,
she whispered.
I don't know what I'd do without you.
Mike hugged her back, a bit awkwardly at first, but then with more confidence.
So,
he said, as they pulled apart.
I guess Scott isn't the right name anymore, huh?
Ruby smiled. I've been thinking about that. I like Ruby. It feels right. Mike nodded.
Ruby,
he repeated, testing out the name.
It suits you. Your necklace, too.
Ruby touched the ruby pendant at her throat. I found it in my jewelry box. It's like everything changed to fit this new me.
So what do you want to do now?
Mike asked. We can't keep you hidden in here forever. Ruby took a deep breath. I think I need to tell my family. They're going to find out eventually. Better it comes from me than them walking in and finding a stranger in my room. Mike squeezed her hand.
Do you want me to stay? For support?
Ruby nodded gratefully. Please, I don't think I can do this alone. Together, they made their way downstairs. Ruby's heart pounded so hard she was sure Mike must be able to hear it. Her mother was in the kitchen, humming as she washed dishes. She turned as they entered, her eyes widening in surprise. Oh, hello, she said, looking from Mike to Ruby. I didn't realize Scott had company. Are you a friend from school? Ruby took a deep breath. Mom, she said softly. It's me. It's Scott. Her mother's brow furrowed in confusion. I don't understand. Scott's upstairs. He wasn't feeling well this morning. Mom, please, Ruby said, her voice trembling. I know this is going to sound impossible, but I am Scott. I woke up like this morning. I don't know how or why, but it's really me. Her mother's face paled, the dish in her hands slipping and shattering on the floor. That's not possible, she whispered.
Mrs.
Johnson,
Mike interjected gently.
I know it sounds crazy, but it's true. I've talked to her. It's Scott.
Ruby's mother sank into a chair, her eyes never leaving her transformed child. But how? She asked weakly. I don't know, Ruby admitted. I went to sleep last night as myself, and I woke up like this. Everything's changed. My body, my clothes, even my voice. Her mother stood up slowly, approaching Ruby with cautious steps. She reached out, touching Ruby's face gently. Your eyes, she murmured. They're the same. Scott's eyes. Ruby felt tears spilling down her cheeks. It's me, Mom. I'm still your child. I'm just different now. Her mother pulled her into a tight embrace, her own tears falling. Oh, sweetheart, she whispered. What are we going to do? Ruby hugged her back, relief washing over her. I don't know, she admitted. But we'll figure it out together, right? Her mother nodded, pulling back to look at her. Of course we will. You're my child, no matter what. We'll get through this. Over the next few hours, Ruby's father and sister were brought into the loop. The reactions ranged from disbelief to shock to cautious acceptance. It was a lot to take in, but Ruby was overwhelmed by the love and support her family showed her. As the day wore on, the initial shock began to fade, replaced by practical concerns. How would they explain this to the outside world? What about school, Ruby's friends, her future?
We'll take it one day at a time,
her father said, squeezing her shoulder.
Whatever you need, we're here for you.
That night, as Ruby lay in bed, her mind raced with thoughts of the future. Everything had changed in the span of a day, and she knew there would be challenges ahead. But she also felt a sense of peace she'd never experienced before. For the first time in her life, she felt truly herself. As she drifted off to sleep, Ruby wondered what the new day would bring. Whatever it was, she knew she wouldn't face it alone. She had her family, she had Mike, and most importantly, she finally had herself, her true self. The next morning, Ruby woke to sunlight streaming through her window. For a moment, she wondered if it had all been a dream, but as she sat up, she felt the now familiar weight on her chest and saw the cascade of auburn hair falling over her shoulders. It hadn't been a dream. She was still Ruby. She got out of bed, her movements more graceful now as she adjusted to her new body. Opening her closet, she surveyed her options. After some deliberation, she chose a flowing blue dress that fell just above her knees. She paired it with the black flats from yesterday, not quite ready to tackle heels just yet. As she was brushing her hair, there was a knock at her door. "Ruby?" her sister's voice called. "Can I come in?" "Sure, come on in," Ruby replied, still marveling at the sound of her new voice. Her sister, Emma, entered the room, her eyes widening as she took in Ruby's appearance. "Wow," she said softly. "You look beautiful." Ruby felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "Thanks," she said shyly. "It's still so strange, looking in the mirror and seeing someone else looking back." Emma sat down on the bed, patting the spot next to her. Ruby joined her, smoothing her dress as she sat. "How are you feeling?" Emma asked. "I mean, really feeling. This must be so overwhelming." Ruby was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "It is overwhelming," she admitted. "But at the same time, I feel more like myself than I ever have before. Does that make sense?" Emma nodded, taking Ruby's hand in hers. "It does. You know, I always felt like there was something you weren't telling us, like you were holding back somehow. But now, looking at you, you seem more relaxed, more at peace." Tears welled up in Ruby's eyes. "I didn't even realize it myself until now," she said. "But I think you're right. I've always felt not quite right in my own skin. And now, suddenly, everything fits." Emma pulled her into a hug. "I'm so happy for you, Ruby. And I want you to know, I'm here for you. Whatever you need. Advice, someone to talk to, a shopping buddy," she added with a grin. Ruby laughed, wiping away her tears. Thanks, Em. That means more than you know. As they made their way downstairs for breakfast, Ruby could smell coffee brewing and hear her parents' voices in the kitchen. She paused at the bottom of the stairs, suddenly nervous. Emma squeezed her hand. It's okay, she whispered. They love you, no matter what. Taking a deep breath, Ruby entered the kitchen. Her parents looked up, their conversation halting for a moment. Then her mother smiled warmly. Good morning, sweetie. How did you sleep? Pretty well, actually, Ruby replied, sliding into her usual seat at the table. It's still strange waking up like this, but I'm starting to get used to it. Her father set a cup of coffee in front of her.
We've been talking,
he said, sitting down across from her.
About how we're going to handle this situation.
Ruby felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. Oh? She said, trying to keep her voice steady. Her mother reached out, patting her hand reassuringly. We think it might be best if we move, she said gently. Start fresh somewhere new, where no one knows us. It might be easier than trying to explain this to everyone we know. Ruby considered this. The thought of leaving behind everything familiar was daunting, but she could see the logic in it. What about school? She asked. And Mike? We've looked into online schooling options, her father said. At least for the rest of this year, while you adjust. As for Mike, well, that's up to you. He's been a good friend to you, and he's handled this situation remarkably well. Ruby nodded slowly. I'd like to keep in touch with him, she said. He's been so supportive through all of this. Of course, her mother said. We wouldn't ask you to cut ties with him, but a fresh start might be good for all of us. What do you think? Ruby took a sip of her coffee, mulling it over. The idea of a new beginning was appealing, a place where she could just be Ruby without the ghost of Scott hanging over her. I think that might be good, she said finally. It's scary, but exciting too. Her parents smiled, relief evident on their faces. We'll start making arrangements, her father said. In the meantime, why don't you and Emma go shopping? You could use some more clothes, and it might be good for you to get out of the house for a bit. Ruby felt a mix of excitement and nervousness at the prospect. Are you sure that's safe? She asked. What if someone recognizes me? Emma laughed. Ruby, no offense, but I don't think anyone's going to look at you and see Scott. You look completely different now. Ruby had to admit she had a point. Okay, she said, a small smile forming on her lips. Let's do it. After breakfast, Ruby and Emma headed to the local mall. Ruby felt self-conscious at first, constantly worried that people were staring at her, but as they moved from store to store, she began to relax. No one gave her a second glance. She was just another woman out shopping with her sister. In one boutique, Ruby found herself drawn to a red dress similar to the one she'd borrowed from her sister that fateful night. You should try it on, Emma encouraged. Ruby hesitated for a moment, then nodded. In the dressing room, she slipped the dress on, marveling at how perfectly it fit her new body. When she stepped out to show Emma, her sister gasped. Ruby, you look stunning, Emma said, her eyes wide. You have to get it. Looking at her reflection in the mirror, Ruby had to agree. The dress hugged her curves in all the right places, the color making her auburn hair seem to glow. For the first time, she truly saw herself as beautiful. As they were leaving the mall, bags in hand, Ruby's phone buzzed with a text from Mike. "How are you doing? Want to hang out later?" Ruby smiled, quickly typing back a response. "Doing good. Shopping with Emma. Would love to hang out. Come over for dinner?" Mike's reply came moments later. "Sounds great. See you then." That evening, as Ruby set the table for dinner, she felt a sense of normalcy settling over her. Her mother was cooking in the kitchen, her father was watching the news, and Emma was helping with the salad. It was just like any other family dinner, except for the fact that their son was now their daughter. The doorbell rang, and Ruby's heart skipped a beat. "I'll get it," she called, smoothing her red dress as she went to answer the door. Mike stood on the porch, a bouquet of flowers in his hand. His eyes widened as he took in Ruby's appearance.
Wow,
he said softly.
Ruby, you look amazing.
Ruby felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "Thanks," she said, taking the flowers. "These are beautiful. Come on in." As they sat down to dinner, Ruby was struck by how natural it all felt. The conversation flowed easily, with Mike fitting in seamlessly. He asked Ruby about her shopping trip, genuine interest in his voice as she described the outfits she'd bought. After dinner, Ruby and Mike sat out on the back porch, watching the sun set.
"So,"
Mike said, breaking a comfortable silence,
"your dad mentioned you guys might be moving."
Ruby nodded. "Yeah, we think it might be easier. A fresh start, you know?" Mike was quiet for a moment.
"I'll miss you,"
he said finally.
"But I get it. And hey, we'll still keep in touch, right?"
"Of course," Ruby said, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "You're my best friend, Mike. That's not going to change, no matter where I am." Mike smiled, squeezing her hand back.
"Good. Because I don't know what I'd do without you in my life, Ruby Johnson."
As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Ruby felt a sense of peace wash over her. The future was uncertain, full of challenges she couldn't even imagine yet, but she knew she could face them. She had the love and support of her family, a true friend in Mike, and most importantly, she had finally found herself. Ruby looked up at the night sky, a small smile playing on her lips. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she was ready to face it, as her true self, at last.
Thanks for watching, my girlies! Be sure to check out Patreon for more!